In a small Muslim cemetery in Granada, Spain, sits an unimposing, simple grave of a man named Muhammad Asad. It states that he lived between 1900 and 1992, and it has inscribed upon it some verses of the Quran. On its basis alone, nothing more can be deduced about the life of the person buried on the site, though the grave is often visited by tourists to the city. The same name appears in a square in the 22nd district of Vienna, which honored this individual in a UN ceremony of 2008 devoted to celebrating multiculturalism. Then, in 2013, a Pakistani stamp in the value of Rs 15 bore an image of the same man. Who was Muhammad Asad, and what is the reason for this growing interest ranging from Pakistan to Germany in this person? Muhammad Asad was born in 1900 as Leopold Weiss in a Jewish family of Galicia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He hailed from a traditional family of rabbis on his father's side, and though in his father's generation a break from the older family occupation with religious scholarship had waned, Leopold had gotten sufficient training in his religion so as to be able to read and speak Hebrew fairly well by the time he was 13. Leopold's maternal grandfather was a well-known and wealthy local banker, and this fact, along with his father's profession as a barrister, afforded him a rather comfortable life in his youth. In his teenage years, he voluntarily joined the Austrian army, only later to be recovered by his father, who disapproved of this choice and brought him home. At this stage, he was pressed to go to university, where he found great attraction in philosophy and art and found himself often engaging the intellectual currents in the cafes of his time. Yet the prospect of the academic life did not attract Leopold. He dropped out of university after only 2 years of study and turned to the possibility of journalism. It was likely his wandering spirit that had brought him to this profession, for from a rather early period he found solace in observing the varieties of human environments and their social, political, and cultural orders. Leopold's attraction for observing and studying human societies was coupled with a budding creative spirit, which led him to collaborate with some actors and writers in order to produce a couple of screenplays at this time as well. Yet neither journalism nor literary creativity were the ultimate objectives for Leopold. They were only a means to observing, interpreting, and creatively shaping the world. These possibilities began to take actual shape for him when, at the age of 22, he received a fateful letter from an uncle who directed a psychiatric hospital in Jerusalem. The letter invited young Leopold to the Holy City to live among the Arabs and to inhabit, for a while, a different kind of world. The prospects of expanding his intellectual horizons were immediately appealing to the young man, who quickly sent a resignation from his assistantship as a journalist and set out for Jerusalem. The year that Leopold spent amidst the complex layers that constitute the city, among the Jews, Christians, Muslims, Arabs, and Europeans, rich and poor, had perhaps the most transformative effect on his life. As a naturally keen observer of human societies and as a prescient thinker, Leopold realized quickly that Western representations of the Orient that shaped the European social imaginary as a contrast to the East were utterly romanticized. This was the case whether the reading of the East was hostile or amicable, academic or popular. Taking every opportunity to live amidst the common people of the city, the young man discovered a different reality than the one he had expected when his glance upon this world was cast from the distant lands of Europe. This world was different indeed, but it had its own varieties of cultural, social, and religious life. Its complexity could only be felt via lived experience, not through the filters of other traditions. In Jerusalem too, Leopold began to form the conviction that the true heirs of his Jewish identity were the Arabs. In a famous passage in one of his books, he describes a poignant moment he saw the silhouette of an Arab against the darkening sky, and how this triggered in him a sense that the warriors who accompanied David must have borne a profound similarity to this man. In other words, the Jerusalem Leopold witnessed led him both to experience the East beyond the Orientalizing myths and through his Jewish faith. Upon his return to Europe the next year, Leopold began to write Das Unromantische Orient, The Unromantic East, a short work in which he discussed many of his thoughts and experiences. In its insights about and criticism of the Orientalist narratology familiar in Europe at this time, he incredibly foreshadows the work of major anthropologists and thinkers of the second half of the 20th century. Leopold Weiss published this work in 1924 at the age of only 24. The success of this work launched Leopold's career as a journalist. He was afforded 2 years by a leading European newspaper to conduct research in the Middle East and Asia and to produce a book about his travels. With this contract now in hand, Leopold set off on his adventures and began a second stage of internal transformations by way of his extended encounters with Muslims in Syria, Egypt, and Afghanistan, among other countries. Among the various formative experiences, he was to recall fondly his conversations with the future rector of Al-Azhar, Mustafa al-Maraghi, and a conversation with an Afghan who claimed that the young Leopold had already embraced the religion of Islam, though he himself had yet to realize this fact. Leopold returned to Europe at the age of 26 and spent the next year soul-searching. This was a period of a different focus for him, for he had turned inward, trying to take account of his own person after the wanderings and growth of the past 3 years. In this process of reflection, he found solace in his siblings and in his friendships. He also married during this period a woman by the name of Elsa, an earlier acquaintance who had been widowed at a young age. During this period of introspection, Leopold could not bring himself to the process of writing the book promised to the press that had employed him. The distraction was so intense that he broke off the contract. Then, early the next year in 1927, a series of epiphanies quickly led Leopold to the decision to adopt Islam. Primary among these spiritual openings was his realization that Europe, even secular Europe, was the heir to religious traditions that drew boundaries between the body and the soul. This dichotomy was something that Leopold found utterly lacking in the Islamic tradition. Later in life he wrote, quote, "Because of Europe's long, almost exclusive association with Christianity, even the agnostic European had subconsciously learned to look upon all religious experience through the lens of Christian concepts, and would regard it as valid only if it was accompanied by a thrill of numinous awe before things hidden and beyond intellectual comprehension. Islam did not fulfill this requirement. It insisted on a coordination of the physical and spiritual aspects of life on a perfectly natural plane." End quote. Indeed, as Leopold learned more about Islam through its holiest book, the Quran, he found this attraction of comprehending the divine through the human further endorsed. His favorite expression in the Quran was لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. It is for a people who are able to reflect. 2 weeks after his conversion, amidst this newly gained certainty and direction in life, Leopold's wife Elsa also embraced the faith, and the two, along with Elsa's son, left for Saudi Arabia. Leopold, who was now to be known as Muhammad Asad, was 27 years old. Saudi Arabia opened up possibilities that Muhammad Asad could hardly have imagined. It was a homecoming of the heart, as he later remembered it. The very year of his arrival, Asad met Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia in a library, and in virtue of a recommendation by him, he was introduced to King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, Much impressed by this new convert to Islam, the king had a number of conversations with him, so that eventually Asad became his close advisor and confidant for the next few years. During the next 5 years in the Middle East, Asad acquired Arabic, studied early Islamic history, and traveled the length and breadth of the peninsula. He was also welcomed into the Shammar tribe from Al-Ha'il when he married a daughter of theirs. At the same time, Asad served the king by going on missions to Libya to report on the guerrillas under the command of Omar al-Mukhtar. He also went to Kuwait on a diplomatic mission on behalf of the kingdom. As a correspondent for some European newspapers, he continued to report on developments in the Middle East. In 1932, the same year a son was born to him, Asad left Saudi Arabia and arrived in India, where he was soon to befriend the poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. Conversations with Iqbal convinced Asad to stay on in India and to participate in the Pakistan movement and to contribute to Iqbal's project of the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. Thus, in 1934, Muhammad Asad published his celebrated book, Islam at the Crossroads, which boldly addresses the issue of Muslim revival. The next few years of Muhammad Asad's life were dark. The outbreak of the Second World War led to his imprisonment by the British. During these years, he worked feverishly on a translation and commentary of the canonical hadith collection of Imam Al-Bukhari, much of which was unfortunately lost in the disturbances of 1947. After the founding of Pakistan in this same year, Muhammad Asad was invited to join the Department of Religious Reconstruction and later the Foreign Service as Pakistan's representative to the United Nations. This was a post he held until he resigned in 1955. In this same year, he published his autobiography, a moving and eloquent account of his turn to Islam called The Road to Mecca. In later years, he would go on to publish 2 more important works, his magnum opus, a translation of the Quran called The Message of the Quran, and an important reflection on the relation of Islam to government called The Principles of State and Government in Islam. Muhammad Asad was a truly gifted intellectual. His first book, The Unromantic Orient, which he wrote at the age of 23, is partly a protest against the overwhelming and blinding tendency of earlier Orientalist scholarship on the Middle East that tends to dissociate it from the possibility of an organic and lived modern reality. Muhammad Asad had noticed in his first visit to the Middle East that, far from the idealized world of magic and mysteries, of irrationality and passions that Western literature of his time often made out to be, the Orient, and especially the Arabs, had simply escaped the malaise of a hard-pressing materialism that had begun to engulf the West. He writes of the Arabs, "You are timeless. You jumped out of the course of world history. You are the contemporary ones until you will be invested by will, and then you will become bearers of the future." These sentiments, said not of Muslims or Islam, but of a culture that was invested with the religious ethos, ring much like Iqbal's hopes for Muslims. Ut ke khurshid ka saman-e safar taza karein. Awake, let us revive the new day. This very early work of Muhammad Asad may well be considered to be the first intervention against the earlier orientalizing tendencies of the Western imagination, foreshadowing his embrace of Islam and of his lifelong quest to revive it. These observations of a young Muhammad Asad of 23 take on mature shape in his book Islam at the Crossroads. Perceptive and prophetic in its analysis, this book of 1934 views Islam as a third force between communism and capitalism, the 2 major world ideologies. Muhammad Asad published an important translation of the Quran in 1980. It departs in significant ways from the mainstream translations and interpretations. Asad interpreted the events of Isa speaking from the cradle of the test of Ibrahim by the fire, and other similar miracles allegorically. Muhammad Asad has been called by some Europe's gift to Islam. Perhaps no other convert to Islam in the modern age so quickly embodied and contributed to the discourses on Islam, whether it be political, social, or cultural, than him. His journey to Islam and within Islam was also quite remarkable and unique. Born in a Jewish family with traditional scholarly roots and trained in Hebrew and the rabbinic tradition, Muhammad Asad saw something of a Jewish inheritance in Arabs and in Islam. His knowledge of this other Abrahamic religion and of the sister monotheism of Christianity made him an informed and sophisticated recipient of Islam. And his exposure to the breadth and range of the tradition in various places, among diverse peoples, in the wide and entire span of the critical 20th century, with its swiftly transforming political scenes, all of this and more gave Muhammad Asad an understanding of Islam in the modern age that few could possibly boast. He died in 1992 in Granada and was survived by Paula Hamida, his wife of several decades, and by his son Dalal Asad, a professor of anthropology in the United States.